when people had this unicorn notion theories and pathways of how you could potentially build large tech companies, you always have diverse opinions. Some people think that it's too hard, it's not possible. Some people think that China has done it. This region is a quarter of China's economy. Why can't it do it? Some people are acknowledging that challenges are enormous, but it takes some great entrepreneurs to overcome this. These are all narratives. There's lots of criticism about VCs, but they're responsible for their money, for the people's money. They actually aren't that professionally. And some companies work hard, some companies don't work out. Some people have greater judgment than others. Some people have greater luck than others. This is all part of the normal economy. And as a result, the infrastructure gets better, the payment gets better, the logistics gets better. So the people's choices of goods and stuff gets better.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. You don't want to miss Geeks on a Beach, the unique premier startup conference in the region. Join us from November 13th to 15, 2024 at J Park Island Resort in Mactan, Cebu. This event brings together tech enthusiasts, investors, and entrepreneurs for 3 days of workshops, talks, and networking. Register at geeksonabeach.com and use code BRAVEC for a 45% discount for the first 10 registrations and 35% off for the next ones. Hey, morning.
Hey, morning.
Yeah. Wow. Where are you in the world now today?
Somewhere in China. So been traveling nonstop for about 4 weeks. Started from Jakarta, then went to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Then spent a whole week in Vietnam. Then flew directly to Beijing, from Beijing to Xi'an. Now I'm at my parents' place for a short stay of 1 day. Then tomorrow I'm going to Hangzhou. And from Hangzhou I'm going to Changsha. From Changsha I'm going to Shanghai. And from Shanghai back to Singapore. So I don't know how to describe that kind of feeling, right? You just like, you get overwhelmed about all the senses, all the people you know who tell you about what's happening in different places, and you try to reflect about what they say, try to draw some connections, and that makes you mentally exhausted.
You know, that reminds me of like what Journey to the West and Journey to the East, right? But now we can do it within 12 hours, right?
Yeah, I was just in Xi'an, sort of the ancient capital of China, for oddly a reunion of my MBA class. So they just picked that place, and that place was the start point of the Silk Road, and it was also the starting point of the journey to the West. So there's lots of cultural relics, but there's also lots of stories, and people tell you about historically how people connected with the different kingdoms in the West and all the way to India and all the trade and stuff. It's fascinating, but it's just overwhelming, right? We try to get access to the biggest museum in that city, and that museum gives out 12,000 tickets a day, and you have to book like 2 days in advance. We tried for the whole 4 days we were there. We tried like each of the session, we tried to book tickets, and each time the 12,000 tickets were sold out, or booked out within 40 seconds after it was released on the Meituan website. And then we went to a minor museum. So people said that, okay, this museum compared to the other one, there's nothing, and we planned 2 hours to be in it. We hired someone to help us guide through and do the briefing and stuff. We ended up spending the whole day there.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting, right? Because Journey to the West is actually a very famous Chinese, I don't know what you call it, story or literature, which is about this Buddhist monk who follows the Silk Road to travel to India from China because he wants to bring back these literature texts about Buddhism back to China, because India is the birthplace of Buddhism. And it's quite interesting because obviously India is the birthplace of Buddhism. But of course, in today's world, China absorbed it via the Silk Road. But of course, India doesn't really have a big Buddhist traditional practice right now, right? So it's primarily China that does it, as well as to some extent like China, Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia. So I think it's quite interesting
And Sri Lanka.
cultural piece. And yeah, Sri Lanka as well. So this is very interesting travel along the routes.
So let's look at the story. I mean, Journey to the West itself was legend, because you have all these figures who do not exist in the normal world. And the legend goes that I think a few of them were previously part of the Jet Emperors, the supreme ruler of the heaven, and of his generals, his marshals, and because of certain like minor or major offenses, and they were condemned to the earth realm to become piggies, to become shark, to become all this. And somehow they formed a team led by this monk to overcome 81 difficulties to get the Rose to Trust from India. The story really came about around Ming Dynasty. People think that orally that the people have been telling the story before that, and some people are tracing that the monkey came to Hanuman in in sort of the sort of Indian mythology. But the story really took roots in China, and especially in the last 30 to 40 years. In 1986, CCTV, the Central Television of China, made a TV series about that. And it was directed by a famous director. And back then, you didn't have a lot of visual effects. So she faked lots of visual effects. But somehow, some of people missed that period of optimism, right? You don't have the means, but you have this simple joy that you can look forward to. And Journey to the West was that TV series was played every summer. So I think all the kids in China born in 1980s and 1990s would look forward to watching it again every summer on TV. And as I discovered when I was in university, that it was the same thing for all the kids in Vietnam. So basically, they have a version adapted into Vietnamese, and it was played every summer. I was reminded about this last week when I was in Vietnam. So I was taking a taxi, and the driver's ringtone was a theme song of that, but obviously in Vietnamese, which was quite funny.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, that's interesting because it's like two stories, right? One is a real life, actual story of a Buddhist monk who actually
Mm.
did that travel, and he traveled through obviously from Chang'an to Kyrgyzstan to Uzbekistan to Afghanistan to
Mm.
Pakistan to now India and then
Mm.
all the way back. So there's a real story historically. And of course, there's the legendary one, which is obviously there's a monkey king, like you said, there's a pig, there's a shark. So it's actually like, I don't know what's the word, it's like two stories. So it's interesting. And both of those stories actually are very important. And I think now we were chatting briefly about what there's the new Black Myth Wukong, which is the based on the fantastical version of it. It's a
Mm.
AAA game. It's
Mm.
very popular, sold out. It's number 1 on Steam. I think
Mm.
it's probably is this the first game that China has made it AAA and made it all the way?
I'm not sure whether it's the first, but it's definitely the first one in a long term. The guy who produced this game has been known in the sector for more than 10 years. And I think back in 2016 or 2017, he wrote a long article saying that the whole gaming industry in China is too short-term focused, too money focused. And there's nobody who had the patience to basically produce a real like a masterpiece. And this Black Myth Wukong game, I think it took like 6 years to produce. And I'm not sure if you played it. I haven't. So I have it, but I haven't got a chance to play it. I don't usually play games, but I just want to see because it really took the whole sector by storm. And last week when I was in Vietnam, I mean, there were a few visitors from China, from the live commerce industry, and the head of finance of one of the companies was saying that, hey, if I were not traveling to Vietnam for business this weekend, I would have been playing the game at home in Hangzhou. So it really took things by storm. And this time when I was in Xi'an, my friends suggested that we visit a small temple, which is like an hour and a half drive out of Xi'an, on an island in the middle of a stream, which is by itself is funny. And the way she convinced everybody else to go is that, okay, a few scenes from Wukong was taken from that temple. They would say, oh, sure, we must go. And temple from outside just looks like a normal temple. It's like small, petite. But when you went to I think the third, like, I don't know how to describe that. For a temple, you have a different sort of buildings, the third building, and you were sort of immersed with Ming Dynasty, like, carvings and all this bas relief and vivid figures, which were sort of taken and reproduced in a game. And apparently that the game producers, they went to different parts of China, go to ancient temples and stuff, and to find all these relics and all these sort of interpretations of Buddhist mythology and stuff. And I don't know how to describe that. We talk about it, say, okay, sure, we must go. But when you are there, you get overwhelmed. It's just a very small room, but thousands of figurines on a wall and intricately carved like 600-700 years ago. And there are a few other temples which are a bit further away. Further away means like a few thousand kilometers away. So we didn't get a chance to go, but one of my friends actually went to some of those even older temples. Some of the carvings were done like 8th century, 9th century. And I always thought that the cultural relics and all this craftsmanship in the northern part of China was simple compared to what you typically see in Hokkien or Cantonese temples, because it was much easier to organize trade of different materials and craft and people, the workers, oversee than overland, right? Overland is like, I mean, talking about journey to the west is easily a few thousand kilometers with no man, and you have to pass dangerous and sometimes hostile territories. But still, it was overwhelming.
Yeah. I think one interesting part is that I find like a lot of these temples are so full and so dense. I think with all the various relics that they've gathered, which is quite different, of course, from the Western museums, which tend to be much more, I don't know, curated. They have everything is a lot of it is in the back, right, in storage, and then they rotate out items and they have a lot of explanation. So they're a bit of a narrative piece versus I think a lot of the Chinese temples are more. It's like what you see is everything we got, right? So it's very dense.
The museum we went to was, since I was in that city, I was just studying about the museums, of course, the one we went to. And even a minor like stone stool outside left like randomly in a courtyard is like 2,000 years old. It's just crazy. And many museums were actually built on top of a discovery. Basically discovered a lot of cultural relics and dug out of the ground in order to protect, in order to store it. They built a museum. Then they expanded the museum. They started keeping things which are discovered in villages nearby and stuff. And soon, boom, there's a museum that is worth like a day or a few days visit.
Yeah. So you said that the producer of Black Myth Wukong said that the gaming industry in China is very short-sighted. Could you share more about why is it short-sighted?
I read his article about a week ago. Of course, I'm not in the gaming industry, so when he first wrote it, like almost 10 years ago, I didn't read it. But essentially, he was saying that so people are too focused on money, right? So last 15 years, there's a boom of consumer access to mobile internet, access to mobile gaming, and you don't need to produce something super sophisticated, but you just need to produce something simple and addictive casual games and get people to top up and stuff. So it was very easy to make money back then, and to produce the AAA piece, it takes years, right? Especially with Wukong, I mean, you have literally sent team to all these places to basically replicate all these carvings and stuff, and you need to understand the history really well, etc., etc. So the whole production takes much longer, and historically, it's a very difficult decision because I mean, when I mean historically, it's like over the last 15 years, it was a very difficult decision for you to tell your investors that I'm going to spend all this money and I might not be able to see any results in 6-7 years time, and what all my peers are sort of making big bucks by just like producing short videos or selling casual games. So it was a difficult sell to investors, and it's a difficult sell to a team as well, because the same thing here, and then people look at their peers making lots of money and they're saying that, hey, I'm here doing craftsmanship. And it's just not something that people are used to. In a society where things are changing very fast, where big money is made, it's very difficult for people to keep patience.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. The Chinese gaming industry is huge. So some of the statistics I read before is that there's about 700 million players, which is pretty much about half of all Chinese people game. And then basically the gaming industry is about $66 billion today, USD, expected growth rate around 8%. And there's obviously all these famous games, right? PUBG is a big one, Honor of Kings. So obviously Tencent and NetEase, these also like unicorn billion-dollar companies are quite focused on building these freemium games, mobile games, casual games, and yeah, it's a huge industry already. In fact, I would say that this is probably like the first AAA game I've really seen on my end. I'm a bit of a, I guess, casual gamer. I was a big gamer back in the past, and now I just primarily watch gaming videos and follow the gaming industry. I think this is the first time where also I've seen even like Black Myth Wukong be famous outside China, I would say. You see people in America or Canada also playing the game as well. So it's quite interesting global appeal.
I think production quality is definitely something, right? You took so many years to build this masterpiece. And second, I think there are lots of things it can tap into. So it's not that you are building something completely new. You have a story that all the people, presumably most people in sort of East Asian cultures are familiar with. And also people find resonance to. The journey to the West, or the mythology part of the journey to the West, has been used in many things. Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, once said that the monk was like one of the probably the best leader in history. He's very determined, and he doesn't have the super hard powers, but he never gives up. No matter how hard things are, he never gives up. He motivates his team and stuff. And the monkey has some superpowers. But it was funny, right? If you read the story, which I read a few times, that for many of the big monsters or sort of the big adversaries that you encounter along the way, he can't really defeat them purely by power. And what he essentially does is that he discovers, oh, this monster used to be the mount of this like immortal in a heavenly palace. And obviously, because of whatever reason, that mount, be it like a turtle, be it or whatever, then came to the earthly realm and to become a monster. So what he essentially does is that he goes to the heaven and he looks for the boss. He said, dude, your mount has been doing these bad things. Let's make a deal. So essentially, he does a lot of that. And people are looking at it and people are saying that, okay, you have the superpowers, but sometimes a relationship counts much more than the superpowers.
Isn't that the moral of all of China business?
And there you have the pig, right? The pig is, of course, he has some superpowers, but compared to what the monkey has, it's very limited, which means that he can only defeat about like 10% of the adversaries they encounter along the way. But the piggy has one, which I wouldn't call superpower, but has one skill is that he makes the whole team fun. He makes the whole journey less dull. And there's also this shark, right? The shark almost never talks. So joke goes that in the whole TV series produced in 1986, there were only 2 lines of the shark, which were repeated throughout the series. First is that, oh, our master has been caught by a monster. The second is that, oh, our big brother has been caught by a monster. What should we do? So he doesn't have any skill, but that guy is fiercely loyal and he never complains. he always takes the biggest burden, and etc. etc. So then there's another figure, which is the horse. The horse was the son of the dragon king, I think in the East Sea or the Northern Sea, I can't remember, but essentially it's a dragon. So at normal times he just transforms into a horse, but in extreme difficult situations he will revert to his original form of a dragon and help things out. So you see, I'm not sure whether the author had thought about all this, and maybe just a sort of combination of what you take from mythology and your life experiences. But people now are trying to sort of reinterpret that in many different ways. I think especially these 2 years when the economy is struggling a little bit, so people are trying to find more inspiration in saying that, look, this resonates with what we're going through now, and this is what we need to go through this.
Yeah. So I think we've definitely heard about the Chinese economy struggling a bit. I think one of the interesting pieces is that it comes from different angles, right? So I think the West calling it overcapacity. If you look at it from Southeast Asia, looking at it in terms of like Chinese companies being forced or have to or want to come to Southeast Asia. I think obviously we think about it in terms of the property prices as well in China. So lots of different angles. How are you feeling and thinking about it?
I'm not sure if you heard recently that this restaurant chain called Din Tai Fung, right? The Taiwanese chain famous for the soupy buns. It's popular in Singapore. It's popular in many places. And I think 2 weeks ago, they announced that they would close all the stores in Beijing, 14 stores. All the stores in Beijing would be closed. And obviously, and that news was like caused lots of people to start debating what exactly is happening, right? This is like slightly more premium restaurant where I think with average spending per person of above 100 yuan. And then some people are saying that is because the foreign companies are not back, and so as a result, there's less business dining and stuff. And some people are saying that is because the consumption power has been sluggish. I've been talking to lots of friends this time when I'm here. People still have the money. I feel that there's still lots of cash being stashed away, but a couple of reasons. First, the few years of pandemic caused lots of people to rethink about their lifestyle choices, right? Before the pandemic, everything was vibrant. Everybody had sort of good expectations of the future, and I was speaking with a friend of mine who runs e-commerce for some of the luxury brands in China, and I think one consensus is that many young people are were spending, not really beyond their means, but they were spending on things which are one level above their actual income level, because they expect the income will become better. And obviously, one thing is that, okay, the growth has reached saturation. In a way, you just simply can't grow as that fast forever. But the second is also, after a few years of the pandemic, people sort of realize that, okay, I don't need that kind of stuff, right? I can live perfectly well. And sort of the mindset has been transformed, right? I care about my body, I care about my health, I care less about being luxury, buying all these good bags to show off to my peers. And it's just a whole transformation here. And when we talk about the industrial overcapacity, for sure, because this is how the economy functions. If there's demand, somebody's going in a sort of market economy. Some people is going to organize the production, but of course, like sort of arrange the production, etc., takes time. So that never goes in coherence with the actual demand, which fluctuates in cycles. The problem in China is that you have seen that kind of cycles that you normally see in the West, because a serious downturn would be very serious, and it would be deemed as causing some social problems. So I think the government has been trying very hard to prevent any serious correction, which might not be good, because you have all these risks which are not fully unleashed during a correction. You don't have a correction, so you have all these risks been building up.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, whenever there's a capitalism, there's always boom and bust cycles, right? I think it's by nature, exuberance versus a kind of like a downturn. So I think there's always a bit of a policy dynamic that always needs to happen, which is during the good times, how do you slow it down? During the bad times, how do you invest in it to make it better? Of course, I think in America, and there's a lot of stimulus spending, obviously through deficit spending because of the benefit of being a reserve currency. So I think there's a lot of advantages that they have. And I think during the pandemic, we saw that everybody received a stimulus check that was signed by Donald Trump saying like, hey, this is my money to you. Go ahead and spend it. And then, of course, that was followed by Biden, who also did a giant IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was $1 trillion stimulus over a long period of time, and of course contributed to inflation actually. So that was an interesting piece, but I think there's a lot of stimulus spending there. Now, how's China thinking about getting through this time period with the property bubble deflation?
The problem with the property is that many people buy property. So the property became, for many of the ordinary people, it's the only sort of reliable investment over the last 20 years. Because those whoever who didn't invest in property in early like 2000s or early 2010s regretted it by that late 2010s. And also, I think the stock market in China has not been performing well, like historically. So lots of people lost money on stock market, and that there are not like sophisticated financial instruments. And also, I think the investor education has not been done properly in China in a way that many of the advisors You probably know that. So are very eager to sell products rather than properly educate their investors about risk, right? So property was like something which people saw, I mean, over 20 years as a sure bet, right? I mean, you invest in that, the value will never go down. And so when there's a sign of overcapacity of property, when things start to inflate or trending down a little bit, and that causes a panic, right? And people are trying to sell, and especially lots of people are taking leverage to buy investment properties. So that's a big issue. There are rumors that some new policies are coming out this week. So I'm not sure what's going through policy makers' mind, whether they're sort of trying to avoid like giving out everything at once, trying to test, okay, whether something works. And of course, there are also people sort of arguing that if you don't give a big shock remedy and things will not work. So there's lots of debate in a society. I'm not privy to the thoughts of the exact policymakers on this market, but I do think that the property prices are a key thing preventing sort of young people from spending more in consumption.
It's a interesting problem for sure, because I think this is the first time I think that China's really gone through this property price deflation crisis, I would say. I remember in 2008 when I was there were all these like ghost cities being built, and people were already criticizing back then that all these developers were building all these like properties and people were just buying based investment. So I think we knew this for a long time was coming, at least in terms of the complaints. But I think the bubble went up quite longer for quite a number of years actually. And then when it popped very hard. So I think, I don't know, maybe the key lesson, of course, is when during the tough times, you have to do shock therapy to people spending again, etc. But also, I think you have to pop those bubbles earlier, deflate them as early as possible. Otherwise, you see young people being priced out of being able to buy new homes because people are buying for investment. But then obviously everybody's leveraged out because they're buying for investment. I don't know. It's not a good position to be in.
It's definitely a very tricky situation. And if you think about that, the whole economy is not only, I mean, the property itself is a large part of the economy, but around property, there are lots of like different sectors, like all these like renovation companies, all these home furnishing brands and products, and all this home improvement, etc., etc. It's actually a huge part of the economy. And of course, the sort of property developers will have their suppliers, their suppliers will have their own suppliers. So now I think there's this big cascading sort of effect coming, and obviously it's a very tricky issue to solve, very tricky.
I think there are the famous bankruptcies, right? So we have Evergrande, which is like these folks, developers, they were leveraged up as well. They borrowed money. They also took the deposits of customers to construct new buildings. But of course, with the rise of interest rates globally, plus Chinese policy on like how much leverage they can take, they basically ran out of working capital, right? And they haven't been able to finish their buildings. All those deposits are half built. So they're still stuck in the buildings. A lot of people are complaining and protesting. But it's not only them, right? There's a lot of other folks who are like in similar boats as well.
As I mentioned, that there's lots of other industries closely associated with property, and also the finances of local governments are also closely related to property. I think there's something to do with some tax reform in 1990s, which sort of delineates whatever that can be collected and kept at a local level, and whatever that's collected and sort of kept at the central level. So I think that was the key reason why many local governments resorted to selling sort of land to basically help finance the city building, etc. So that has been going on for more than 20 years. And obviously, local governments spent a lot during the pandemic for all these pandemic sort of measures. And if they couldn't sell land, if the industry sort of growth is flat, there's a debt problem, right? I mean, they have to find money somewhere to basically pay for all this cost and all this service, all this debt.
Yeah, not an easy answer, because these are billions and billions of dollars of constructed buildings. But if you let them go and you don't let them whatever, then obviously consumers are going to protest, and you should just put in money to let it finish, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my speculation is that maybe they will find a way to sacrifice the banks, right? Especially the state-owned banks. But obviously, when to lower the interest rate and etc. etc. So make the banks make less money, but finance the sort of lower the debt burden across the society, so people have more money for investment and spending.
Yeah, I think lower interest rates might be the way to do it. And then basically you end up nationalizing some of the debt vehicles needed, right? Maybe through a state guarantee so that you can finish off building off the assets. But then I think it's a first time ever for the Chinese government to ever do something like this.
Yeah. And also it's hard for us who are not in that boat to comment on it. You probably know as an investor, right? So we put yourself in a founder's shoes, which now you are building things and you were building things before you became an investor. But you see that we're looking from outside to say that, okay, this is an obvious problem. I see that you should resolve it. Versus if you're in a driving seat, that I see this problem and many others I have to balance, right? So it's just not easy job.
Not to mention, people complain that these guys are too big to fail, moral hazard. These guys are getting a bailout, blah, blah, blah. They should bear the consequences. Yeah.
And all these different voices, which you can't afford to completely ignore.
Yeah. It's not easy, right? Because so many developers, like you said, are in trouble, but also construction related companies beyond Evergrande, like Shimao Group and Country Garden. So, what's the response you think for Chinese companies now, right? Part of it is like compete domestically, some of it is also expand overseas to look for new growth. I know Pinduoduo has been doing a lot of expansion using Temu, for example.
There's a lot of desire to go overseas and expand. I was in Jakarta, just saw the amount of like new businesses from China, which we're trying to navigate there, mind-boggling. And in Vietnam, you see there's an article which I can send you, written by some Vietnamese media, saying that there's huge stockpile of warehouses along the Chinese-Vietnamese border, and you have lots of like Vietnamese live hosts in physically in China, like live casting about goods. These are Vietnamese people and to Vietnamese audiences and stuff. So there's lots of effort to actually go out. I think trading is relatively more straightforward because you just produce the goods and you sell it. But of course, depending on how you sell it, it impacts the sort of the sectors in the destination markets differently. Right now, there's all this noise about all this like direct B2C sales from China hurting the local businesses in different countries. Indonesia has been going against cross-border e-commerce for a long time. Brazil and South Africa just raised their taxes and made it very difficult for people to sort of declare a lower value declare lower value for their goods. And then you have all this debate in the US about revoking the de minimis rule, right? So everything below sort of at $100, you get shipped into the US tax-free directly to consumers. So there's all this backlash, and of course that makes the company think that we discussed this last time. How should they maybe take some lessons from the Japanese companies, right? Because much of the produce of Japanese brands are built outside Japan. And I think some Chinese companies are doing that. And when I was in Vietnam, I spoke with some folks from this Chinese TV manufacturer called TCL. So they just celebrated the 25th anniversary in Vietnam. They went in 1999. And of course, tremendous. You also know the brands like Haier, etc. They've been like global for many years. And these companies offer lots of lessons for others. But the tricky part is that I think for Chinese business, they're always very scared of competition, right? Unlike many of the Western companies, you had executives like building case studies and coming out to share their experiences. And the Chinese companies tend to be, as people outside would call it, very secretive because they are first scared of, if I say too much, regulators might find traces of things that I'm doing which is not exactly compliant. And second is that all my competitors are noticing this and they will explore the opportunity I just shared. So there's no incentive for them to share.
Yeah, I think there's actually a lot of Chinese companies that have been in Southeast Asia for quite some time, right? So, for example, Tencent, which was the kind of like gaming publisher we talked about, they also acquired League of Legends in 2011, but they also invested in Shopee, right? And C and Garena. Garena is a subsidiary of C Group, and they have the distribution rights for League of Legends. So I think they have about 20%, I think might be less now, of C Group. And then
Less than 20%
obviously,
now, yeah.
And then obviously we also have Alibaba as well, has a presence in Southeast Asia through Lazada and Redmart, which is also, they've been around for a long time, but all of them have worked quite hard to keep themselves quite low key. I think one more thing I can remember is that I think Tencent is also part of VNG Group, which is the C of Vietnam, the super app of Vietnam, in terms of e-commerce and like local domestic messaging
Social
and
app,
gaming.
payment, etc. Games, yeah. VNG sort of constrained themselves to Vietnam, whilst C Group like went into really different countries. And this is something which I've actually been reflecting. Sorry, this is sidetracking a little bit. Obviously, when Garena was built, and obviously Singapore, it was built out in Singapore, right? And VNG and Garena were invested by Tencent around same sort of years. And Garena was built out of Singapore. And from the beginning, you know that the market is not big enough, that you have to go somewhere else. For VNG, I do think that at that time, people had lots of expectations for the market in Vietnam. So you sort of feel that, okay, you build multiple things for the Vietnamese market. The market is big enough that eventually will return. I don't know. Maybe VNG should have gone out of Vietnam in the early days, but it's very hard to make that call, right? So it's the same for the Chinese companies, right? So many of them, when they have a really good time, so they build the sort of international markets in a more opportunistic way and not in a very super serious way. But now many are forced to. So there's one argument is that could they have done it earlier, build some infrastructure outside that at least they know the market, and when they really try to sort of do it big time now, and they have fewer sort of tough lessons to learn, because they've learned all these lessons at a lower cost in the past. But it's very hard to say because, again, if you're in a driving seat, you see much more things than people from outside commenting on it.
Yeah, outside in, obviously everyone wants to expand and do well in new markets, but inside out, capability wise, your talent, do you have the executives who are comfortable working like in an MNC format, able to cross borders? I think Singapore companies all grow up knowing they have to get outside Singapore because the government is telling them, their friends are telling them, it's like, Singapore's too small. So everybody starts out. And of course, Singapore is a great airport. So everybody has traveled around the region quite a bit. Whereas I think for Vietnam, obviously, it's a less history of like exports in terms of like cross-border team building, for example, right?
I think for most markets, when you look at all this, if you talk about tech per se, in Indonesian companies, if you compare Grab and Gojek, Grab was founded in Malaysia, but very quickly moved to Singapore. And very quickly it was operating in multiple markets, and it was realizing that just these two markets were not enough. And if you look at Gojek, obviously it was rightly so, right? In the beginning, they have still lots of potential for Indonesia, and it will be a distraction for you to go elsewhere, and you have limited resources. But eventually, when you try to go in, we are already big, and you have all these issues which I was discussing with Prof. Chen in our book, right? You have all these people issues, you have all these leadership issues, organizational issues, and product localization issues, and whatever Gojek encountered in Vietnam, in Thailand, expanding into these markets, in a way, fundamentally similar to what Chinese companies or any other companies would expect when you already have a large home market presence and we try to expand into other market, big or small, and you have to juggle all this sort of multi-market organization, which is not easy.
Yeah, this actually reminded me of my theory of the 5 types of unicorns in Southeast Asia. The first is a Singapore breadth story, which is, I think, Asia Partners talked about in their report. But basically, from Singapore, you expand across Southeast Asia. So your Grab and your C Group. The second category is your Indonesia-only approach, which is your Bukalapak, which is your Gojek and Tokopedia. And then your third category is in Vietnam, like you try to do multiple products. So maybe like each product line is $100 million or $10 million of revenue, but you try to stack up 5 to 10 of these product lines, like the super app or mini conglomerate for Vietnam. And then the fourth type is like you just happen to be based in Southeast Asia, but you're actually a global company, like I don't know, crypto, or you just happen to live in Bali or Thailand. And the fifth type is the Chinese companies who are moving to Singapore and becoming Singaporean. So you have your Shane and your ByteDance Singaporean companies now. So those are the 5 types of unicorns I think I'm seeing in Southeast Asia.
Oh, there's another type, which is corporate ventures investing $1 billion into a company and saying that, okay, this company has $1 billion investment of, and obviously it's a unicorn, is worth more than $1 billion. Yeah, so $1 billion have been committed to this company. Obviously, this company is worth more than $1 billion. So that's another type.
It's not mutually exclusive for the first 5, I would say. But sometimes it can become reality, you know?
So again, back to what we discussed earlier about boom bust cycles. When people sort of had this sort of unicorn notion, have all these theories and pathways of how you could potentially build large tech companies. And of course, you always have diverse opinions, right? Some people think that it's too hard, it's not possible, and the region is too diverse. Some people think that, okay, China has done it. This region is a quarter of China's economy. Why can't it do it? And some people are saying that, okay, some people are acknowledging that challenges are enormous, but it takes some great entrepreneurs to overcome this, etc., etc. These are all narratives. I mean, boom bust cycles. So I don't know. There's lots of criticism about VCs, but I think is that they're responsible for their money. They're responsible for the people's money. They're actually out of that professionally, and they take responsibility for what they do. And some companies work hard, some companies don't work out. And some people have greater judgment than others. Some people have greater luck than others. This is all not part of the normal economy, right? And as a result, the infrastructure gets better, the payment gets better, the logistics gets better. So the people's choices of goods and stuff gets better. So yeah, that's good enough.
On that note, let's tie it off, and I'll see you next month.
Yeah, I'll see you around. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.